What's going on, boxing fans? Julian Williams here with the Distance Fantasy Matchup number 70. Rocky Marciano versus George Foreman. Overall, good heavyweight fight. A lot of people wonder about this fight. I guess because of the styles involved. Marciano's the type of fighter who would come forward and apply pressure. And George Foreman was the type of fighter who stood straight up and pretty much had kind of a swarming output. Had a big punch output. Marciano, he had a pretty big punch output as well, but he was more of a fighter who would get stronger in the later rounds. If you look at Marciano, to be quite honest, I think the advantage that he had over a lot of fighters was stamina, and I think that's the reason he looked better in the later rounds than he did in the earlier rounds. That's just my opinion. I just think that maybe it was the stamina that made him, that pretty much brought him the victory quite a bit, because fighters get tired, trying to keep Rocky off of him, and then that's when he would start to pour on, because they get tired and they get frustrated because they wouldn't hurt Rocky, and Rocky had a pretty good chin, though he didn't really face a fighter with the knockout ratio or KO artists like George Foreman. Marciano, I do believe if he goes to the later rounds, he does give Foreman trouble. But anyway, Marciano is the type of fighter who comes in and it seemed to me that there were times he liked being hit. He liked getting in the brawls. He liked getting in the actual fights. And against Foreman, that's what he's gonna get. But the question is, would fighting Foreman be a mistake for Marciano? Because Foreman had brute power, brute strength. George Foreman, could possibly, similar to Duran, knock out a horse more than likely, and that's kind of a myth or a rumor. But overall, I think that George Foreman, he did have a lot of power. Had very powerful shots. He came forward, used his reach to his advantage most of the time. Used the reach. He came forward, and it was just come forward and just throw like all kinds of straight shots to get you on the ropes. But the question is, how would Foreman do if Marciano doesn't take the step back? That's the number one question. How would Foreman do if Marciano doesn't take the step back? If Marciano continues coming forward? In this fight, I do believe that Marciano would take advantage of if the fight doesn't go past, I'd say 3. I think that Marciano would take advantage of the fact that Foreman did not look too good in the later rounds. After rounds maybe 4 or 5, Foreman would kind of start to fade. He wouldn't, his shots, there's not as much power on those shots in rounds 5 and 6 as they were in 1 and 2. You see a steady decline in Foreman, as the fight progresses, and he would get this spurt of energy in one of the later rounds, but he couldn't keep consistency the whole entire fight. That was always a problem with Foreman. He couldn't keep consistency in the fight. He'd get tired, and Muhammad Ali exposed that. And he did get tired in the Ron Lyle fight. That was another fight he got tired in, and he had to take Ron Lyle out. It was one of those fights where Lyle could have gotten the victory, if he would have fought smart. But I think with that, being a big man with that punching output, being a big man as Foreman was in the punch output, you're definitely going to get tired. And Marciano, he would crouch a little bit low. He would crouch low. He'd come forward, and and then throw hooks to the body. And I think he would throw to Foreman's body, though he wasn't as big as Foreman. A lot of people will argue to whether or not Foreman is too big for Marciano, because 228, 220, 228 at that time was pretty big for a heavyweight. Compared to Marciano's time. Joe Louis era, the heavyweights were about 204, and Marciano was about 185, 180. And Foreman, when he was the champion, he was about 220, and that within that range, within the 220 range. So a lot of people will question whether or not George Foreman is too big for Rocky Marciano. And Marciano, as I mentioned, crouched low, and I think would give Foreman trouble because Foreman, who pretty much throws, he would have to kind of, with Marciano crouched down, he would kind of have to start throwing, downward. And Marciano didn't really have, the head movement like a Mike Tyson, or even you could say Frazier. And Frazier just kind of bobbed and weaved. He didn't necessarily have that type of head movement, didn't necessarily slip shots, but he could eat the shots. But at the same time, it's how many shots can Rocky Marciano eat in the earlier rounds until he gets hurt, until he possibly gets knocked out. Honestly, I look at this fight and I do think about who Marciano has faced. He hasn't faced a fight with the type of knockout ratio that a prime George Foreman had. So, that leaves room to think and ponder. And then you got the size advantage, and the power advantage. And that one overall advantage that Rocky Marciano had was the stamina. That's something that's going to stand out in this fight. Now, if Foreman can't take out Marciano in the early stages of the fight, I think that Marciano would take advantage of that and get a unanimous decision victory. And I think that Foreman, if he can't, if Foreman can hurt Marciano in the earlier stages of the fight, then I can see Foreman knocking him out. Hard fight to call, because I wonder about the size difference between the two. Rocky Marciano is going to crouch down. He's going to give Foreman a lot of trouble. And at the same time, if Foreman lands, he's going to give Marciano trouble, especially with the punch output that he had. Hard fight. I'm going to go with Rocky Marciano in this fight. I like Marciano by a unanimous decision. I like him by unanimous decision because, as I mentioned, I think he's going to crouch down. I think he's going to give Foreman, and due to the fact that he is small, he was a smaller heavyweight, Foreman's going to have to work a lot more than he typically did, against a heavyweight, that's smaller, and that's going to kind of crouch very low. That's going to be a problem. And on top of that, he has had better stamina, and he looked good late in the fight. He looked much better late in the fight, and I think it's because his opponents were a bit worn down. So me, I'm going with Rocky Marciano, unanimous decision, but it is a hard fight to call. And you could talk about the size difference, whatever, but me, I'm just going to go with Marciano. But anyway, that was the distance. Thanks for watching. Peace.